Hello, I'm Anna Midkiff, and I will be presenting my capstone project. My project seeks to answer the question, how can nonprofits make the most of overhead funds? So, to begin, what exactly are overhead funds? These funds are the costs required to run a business or carry out a mission that cannot be directly attributed to any specific business activity, product, or service. These costs include salaries, payroll taxes, rent, utilities, and equipment. The lack of overhead funding is no secret in the nonprofit world. So how does one solve such a seemingly intractable problem? A philanthropist and author suggests that innovation is the key. Philanthropy is often seen as society's risk capital. That means the onus is on philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, and social entrepreneurs to innovate. But philanthropic innovation is not just about creating something new. It also means applying new thinking to old problems, processes, and systems. Applying new thinking. Let's look at how this applies to the social sector. Here we have a young nonprofit just beginning operations. The nonprofit is formed with a social mission to provide much-needed services to the public. The nonprofit begins with some startup funds from founders, early supporters, and stakeholders. The nonprofit is awarded its first grant. This grant is welcomed because it provides funds for program needs. But it has several restrictions. Unfortunately, it is quite limited in the amount of money provided for indirect costs that provide core support for program delivery. So you can see the rain clouds appear, but they're not producing any rain. There are certain efficiency ratios required. The funders mandate that only a fraction of the nonprofit's funding be spent on overhead expenses, using this as a measure of whether the organization is working efficiently and as a primary factor in grant-making decisions. Under pressure from funders to keep administrative expenditures low, nonprofit leadership puts off spending money on vital infrastructure, such as computers and staff training, hampering the ability of the employees to deliver quality program services. Funders usually require nonprofits to keep records on the activities and expenses of the programs that have been given funding. This record keeping is done by the employees of the nonprofit on systems designed to track such data. Unfortunately, many grants do not cover the payroll and system costs that are incurred in preparing these output reports because these are deemed general and administrative expenses and not essential to program delivery. Inadequate infrastructure, employee training, and cash reserves make it difficult for nonprofits to continue to deliver on their mission in the long term. The inability to offer competitive salaries and employee benefits leads to staff burnout and increased turnover, putting the organization's sustainability in jeopardy. Therefore, nonprofits must find ways to break through these funding obstacles and find ways to make the most of their situation. To illustrate why G&A funding is so important, let's look at an analogy described by Vu Lee in his social sector blog, Nonprofit with Balls. And let's bake a cake like a nonprofit. A bakery is renowned for its flourless cakes and cookies. The baker has even been featured in Tasty Pastry magazine. A grantor wants a cake for an upcoming event honoring gluten-free veterans, and so goes to the bakery to discuss the details. The baker is happy and honored to have been chosen to make the cake for the event, and tells the funder the cake will cost $100. This price includes everything the baker needs to make the cake, all the ingredients, the equipment to measure and mix the cake batter, the pans in which the cake will be baked, the electricity to run the stove, and wages for the baker's time. This is all well and good, but the funder has requirements. The funder will only contribute $20 to the bakery to have the cake made. The funder tells the baker that none of that money can be spent on sugar, vanilla, or electricity. And of the $20, the baker can only spend $1 on eggs, but no less than $4 is to be spent on chocolate for the cake. To make up the difference, the baker must find other customers to contribute the remaining $80. The baker has 3 other customers who are willing to help, but they have their own requirements for the costs of the cake. And unfortunately, many of their requirements conflict with one another. One funder will pay for sugar, but not butter. At least the sugar is covered since the first funder was unwilling to pay for it. Another funder will pay for chocolate, but the very first funder is already covering that. So you ask this funder to pay for butter instead, since the other 2 funders won't let you use their money to buy it. But the funder says no. While the cake is baking, the oven thermometer breaks, and none of the funders will pay for the cost of repairs, as they feel that this is not an essential expense in making the cake for the veterans. The whole thing makes the baker's head spin. And the cake turns out terrible. I mean, look at it. No butter, not enough eggs, the oven temperature was all wrong. But the overhead costs are low, the baker met all the restrictions, and kept the cost at $100 as promised. But the cake is still terrible. These things are simply not enough to justify funding programs in this manner. This story illustrates some important facts. First, it's time to change our view from the traditional model of overhead costs taking away from the organization's resources. Because costs in nonprofits are still perceived quite differently than costs in for-profits. Lee Draper pointed out this contradiction in 2003. In the for-profit sector, executives would be fired for mismanagement or would soon run their businesses into the ground if they did not incorporate indirect costs into the costs of goods and services. Yet foundations and corporate giving programs frequently review grant proposal budgets and slice out such items. All costs are important to mission delivery. Food for hungry people, childcare for working parents, and medical care for the sick cannot be provided without the trucks to deliver the food, the electricity to provide the heat and light to the daycare, and the computers that keep patient records. Trying to put the cost of delivering a mission into separate categories of direct and indirect expenses is an exercise in futility. Low overhead rates don't necessarily mean the nonprofit is doing a great job. Comparing nonprofits based solely on overhead efficiency ratios fails to capture the complete picture of the organization's performance. One nonprofit may have very low overhead simply because it scrimps on staff salaries, employee training, and computer upgrades. This can result in poor service delivery that makes little, if any, positive impact on targeted beneficiaries. Another organization may choose instead to invest in competitive salaries in order to attract quality staff and offer good training programs to keep employee skills up to date, and to make necessary system upgrades when needed. This will result in an overhead ratio that may seem quite high when compared to the first organization. However, properly trained staff using modern equipment usually provide higher quality services, which can more readily result in impactful mission delivery. Funder restrictions hamper a nonprofit's ability to carry out effective and impactful programs. Lower overhead funding limits a nonprofit's ability to deliver quality services and achieve lasting positive impact. In their article, The Nonprofit Starvation Cycle, Goggins, Gregory, and Howard described how limited overhead resources can negatively impact a nonprofit. The effects of such limited overhead investment are felt far beyond the office. Non-functioning computers cannot track program outcomes and show what is working and what is not. And poorly trained staff cannot deliver quality services to beneficiaries.